Welcome to Chapter 7 of the text. We'll be looking at power in politics. I think that it's fair to say that when visiting family members or friends at the dinner table, the two topics you don't talk about, which would be last chapter, religion, and this one would be politics. Obviously, people's opinions and rights bestow very valued and personal beliefs for both of these pieces, but I think it's important for us to discuss them both because they do define a culture. So looking at power in politics, what I think is interesting that the author brings into place is looking at the ideas of being of a territory, of being territoriality, being that, okay, this is an area in which that I would like to claim as my own. And how do we see that? We can see it based on fences, property lines, graffiti, markings, signs, by marking your territory, by claiming it, and how as a cultural landscape, we see that often, whether it be, like, again, fences around your property, bars on your windows, painting different things. The book does go into the conversation of the U.S.-Mexico border wall. It also, makes light of the situation that there is not really a wall that goes between the United States and Canada, and that the U.S.-Mexico border wall is not the entire border; it's just small pieces. But how we as a society globally will build walls to either keep people out, or, as we saw at the breakdown in the 90s of the Berlin Wall, of keeping people in. And how does that work? How does that work as a power piece to keep people in? You can think of more recent political events being like of North and South Korea, and how people in North Korea are not able to even identify or talk to anyone around the world, let alone even people that are in South Korea, and that there are walls and political boundaries that devise that system. So it begins in basic terminology, looking at country versus state, looking at a nation versus a nation state, statelessness, identity, imagined communities, looking at people live off the grid, what type of political boundary and line do they have, bringing in the formality of federalism and states' rights, and looking at movements and designs. It also brings in the idea of how over time maps have changed and how different lines and borders have been drawn. There's been many times on the ballot in California to separate California into 6 smaller states. California is huge, but we also have a very diverse political background. We're not necessarily just a red or a blue area. It's very purple, very mixed in certain regions where population is quite dense. But that's not necessarily why people want to split the state into 6 smaller pieces. It has more to do with our carbon footprint and our climatic laws and rules. But moving forward within that, we'll discuss more about then the electoral process and politics, looking at gerrymandering and how we look at different congressional areas and how they're designed and stacked in order to give a certain political parties a better chance or a better vote. So they give some examples of how, even though if you count box to box, there might be more blue versus red, but how it's drawn, it might give blue a more beneficial vote for the electoral college or for a congressional area, or vice versa for a red area. Looking at gerrymandering as a gridlock, and then brings in more of the troublesome piece of politics and power. Why is the power important? Who has the power, and how does it work? Excuse me. Again, moving into the values of red versus blue, which is something that we deal with a lot here in the United States. Other countries don't have that, especially if they're communistic, but looking at more of how we look at the cartographic design of red and blue and how we see the maps during political elections. And then moving into more of the purple versus violet. That's what this author is really kind of pushing towards, is that versus being black and white or red and blue, that there is a mix. How do we give people the opportunity to vote? There's a great TED Talk that discusses that if we could not vote for a particular candidate, but to look at our personal values and beliefs, and we could vote for a particular thing as more of an automated vote system, would be very interesting, because that's what happens is sometimes when you're voting, you're looking for either a party or a particular belief system, but maybe they don't have everything that you believe in or represent everything that you have the foundations for. But what if we could look from a more computerized system of voting, and to then look at, okay, these are all the things that are important to me, politically, and then to really narrow down who best fits for that role to represent you as an individual. And then the text will wrap up with more of power in architecture. Again, looking at why are city halls and places of office designed to look a particular way with more of that Greek and also Greek revival with symbolism. How do we look at newer courthouses, statues? And that's a big piece in our society now, or the bringing down of certain statues and then the erections of others. How does that work within a political piece, and how are um, cultural locations and people dealing with the bringing up and down of these statues? So, as an example, to put it out there, looking at Civil War leaders, either North or South, bringing up and down. When did they go up? How bringing them down, removing them? Um, those are all not, they're originally part of a cultural landscape, but what is the true meaning behind them, and what are some of the values behind that? I mean, you can even bring that back into symbolism of different types of flags and wearing or representing particular flags within the United States past. How does that make people feel? What does it represent? What design does it have to make that be? And so why do or don't we do these? Bringing in even more things more close to us in California, we have a memorial to the Armenian genocide, when there are many nations that do not acknowledge the Armenian genocide. Yet we have a monument erected denoting what had happened there. And there's obviously other evidences behind that, but it's just interesting culturally, by political gain and by negotiations, that certain countries will not acknowledge things like that because of power, not because of anything beyond that. It's specifically because of power and because of politics. And so when you do say that certain things are political, they are. It is very political. Something that's not covered in this chapter with looking at politics is water. I think water is incredibly political, especially looking in California. How Northern California and the Bay Area has a lot more water than Southern California, but how Southern California is given the rights and entitlement and privilege to have water before them, before Northern California, and how they buy it at a higher premium. And so it's kind of the haves versus the have-nots. And sometimes these topics aren't discussed because it is controversial and it is awkward and troublesome. But that's really what this is about, is kind of breaking beyond that boundary and asking some of those questions to inquire more about what is right and wrong, and what does it really stand for. So nonetheless, looking at the cultural landscape of politics and power and what does that mean, I hope that you enjoy this topic and learn a little bit more about the Electoral College and how all that is designed. And don't forget to go out there and vote. We'll talk soon.